Welcome to Delphica. In this video, we will embark on a dark journey into the human psyche, uncovering 3 disturbing true stories of despair and death. These stories feature female killers who, with their terrifying methods of murder, boundless degeneracy, and complete lack of empathy, seem to evoke the ancestral figure of the fairy tale witch. We will delve into the crimes and motives, delving into the most disturbing region of their perverse hearts, presenting to you the Soapmaker, the Vampire, and the Nanny, 3 true stories of contemporary witches. Leonarda Cianciulli, the Soapmaker. The tale of Leonarda Cianciulli is a macabre story of magic, greed, and ignorance that unfolded in Italy in the late 1930s. She was immediately dubbed the Soapmaker by the public and is still considered one of the most notorious female killers in Italian criminal history. Born in 1893 in Avellino, Leonarda described her childhood as sickly, unhappy, and neglected. The complete lack of love from her mother and her father's indifference made her feel alone, rejected, and abandoned for a long time. She grew up without the warmth of a family until adolescence. Despite suffering from epilepsy and having an unattractive appearance, she married in 1917 against her parents' wishes, and in 1930, she moved with her husband and children to Correggio, where she lived a financially stable life for some time. However, a shadow of tragedy hung over Leonarda's life, as she had never forgotten the gypsy's prediction from her childhood. "You will marry, have children, but all your children will die." It is also said that her mother, dissatisfied with Leonarda's choice of husband, cursed her on her wedding day for telling a lie full of pain and suffering. Frightened by the gypsy's prophecy and her mother's curse, Leonarda decided to consult another gypsy sometime later. However, this second gypsy, after reading her palm, confirmed the curse, adding, "I see in your right hand prison, in your left hand a mental asylum." Whether these events were invented by Leonarda during her trial or based on truth cannot be determined, but the prophecy of the first gypsy came true soon. Leonarda had 17 pregnancies, 3 premature births, and 10 children who died in infancy. The 4 surviving children were her treasures, and Leonarda, a rejected and unloved daughter, would kill to protect the only treasures in her life. In 1939, her favorite son, Giuseppe, was studying at the University of Milan. With the war approaching, Leonarda's anxiety grew each day at the thought that Giuseppe might be drafted into the impending conflict. Terrified by the possibility of one of her sons dying, she began studying magic, reading books on palmistry, astrology, and spiritualism, and performing charms and spells. Her goal was to learn everything about curses to neutralize them. She started presenting herself as a fortune teller, reading horoscopes, consulting tarot cards for friends who sought her out, and frequently questioning her own future to save her children. Upon hearing the news that Giuseppe would have to join the military, Leonarda decided decisively on her course of action: human sacrifices in exchange for her son's life. This is when the turning point occurred. Cianciulli had 3 friends, 3 lonely, not-so-young women, one of whom was 70 years old. They all longed to change their lives to escape the boredom and solitude of Correggio. All 3 frequently sought Leonarda's divinatory skills, and she decided that it was time to act. The first to fall into the woman's trap was Faustina Setti, the oldest, who asked Leonarda to consult the cards to see if she could still hope to find a husband. Leonarda convinced her that the cards promised well. Then one day, she finally gave Faustina the news she had been waiting for. An affluent old friend of Leonarda's, naturally non-existent, who lived in Pola, would agree to marry old Faustina. Leonarda persuaded the woman not to speak to anyone about the news to avoid envy and advised her to sell everything she owned. On the morning of her departure to Pola, Faustina came to bid farewell to Leonarda. She was invited to have coffee and then convinced to write some letters and postcards that Faustina would have to send as soon as she arrived in Pola, announcing to relatives and friends that everything was going well. It was while Faustina was writing the letters that Leonarda, standing behind her, split her head open with an axe. The body was dragged into a small room, cut into 9 parts, and all the blood was collected in a basin. All the pieces were thrown into a pot, to which 7 kilograms of caustic soda were added, purchased for making soap. Leonarda stirred it all until the dissected body dissolved into a dark viscous pulp, which was then poured into several buckets and subsequently emptied into a nearby cesspool. As for the blood in the basin, she waited for it to coagulate, dried it in the oven, and ground it, mixing it with flour, sugar, milk, and eggs, then kneading it all together. This resulted in a large quantity of biscuits, which were then served to the ladies who came for consultations. A few days later, Leonarda sent her son Giuseppe to Pola on an errand, asking him to mail Faustina's letters, so they would arrive with the Pola postmark. In the days that followed, Leonarda Cianciulli disposed of the clothing and money that Faustina Setti had brought with her on the morning she was killed. The second victim was Francesca Sovi. She also dreamed of leaving Correggio and desired a job in another city. Leonarda promised her a position at a girls' school in Piacenza. Francesca accepted with gratitude and one morning went to visit her friend before leaving. In this case too, Leonarda convinced the woman to write 2 postcards to announce her departure to acquaintances. The script repeated itself. As soon as Francesca Sovi put down the pen, Leonarda attacked her and repeated the sacrifice. From this death, however, she only obtained the little money the victim had with her. To make more profits, Leonarda claimed in the following days that she had received from Francesca the task of selling the woman's belongings and furniture since she had left for work. Once again, on her mother's orders, Giuseppe went to Piacenza to mail the postcards written by the murdered woman. The third and final victim was Virginia Cacioppo, a former opera singer, 53 years old, reduced to living in poverty. Virginia spent her days reminiscing about her illustrious past, which she reluctantly left behind. Leveraging precisely on Cacioppo's weak point, Leonarda offered her a job in Florence as a secretary for a mysterious impresario who could introduce her to the theatrical world, begging her, as usual, not to tell anyone. Naturally enthusiastic about the proposal, Virginia kept the secret and a few days later visited Leonarda. The woman described the episode as follows. She ended up in the pot like the other two. Her flesh was fat and white, and when it was dissolved, I added a bottle of cologne, and after a long boiling, I got a creamy soap. I gave it away to neighbors and acquaintances. Even the sweets were better. That woman was really sweet. However, this time, the sudden disappearance of the former singer raised some suspicions. There was someone who had seen poor Virginia Cacioppo enter Leonarda's house just before she vanished, and Leonarda, in the meantime, had put all the clothes of the missing woman up for sale. The police chief of Reggio Emilia conducted the necessary investigations and confirmed that indeed all the leads led directly to Mrs. Cianciulli's home. When questioned about what she knew about her friend's disappearance, Leonarda confessed to the 3 murders without resistance. The trial took place in 1946, and Leonarda was sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. In prison, Leonarda Cianciulli spent her time writing, crocheting, and baking crispy biscuits, which no other inmate dared to eat, believing they contained some magical substance. Enriqueta Martí Repulse, the vampire. Behind the story of Enriqueta Martí lies one of the most disturbing figures in Spanish crime history of the 20th century. Dubbed as the Vampire of Caraponent, she was a terrible child murderer. There are varying estimates of her victims, ranging from the initial reports of 40 child deaths to the more widely accepted number of 11 today. Regardless of the number of murders committed, the most horrifying aspect of this story remains the motive. Enriqueta didn't kill due to a mental illness, but rather, it was her source of income, satisfying the most disgusting and perverse inner needs of the ladies and gentlemen of high society at that time. Enriqueta Martí Repulse was born in 1868 in a town near Barcelona, the daughter of an alcoholic and a cleaning woman. She spent her childhood in poverty and soon began working as a domestic servant in various middle-class households. At the age of 16, she realized she could earn much more money by working as a prostitute in the Santa Madrona Port District. From her years in prostitution, she learned about some of the darkest and most depraved desires of human beings and understood that exploiting these desires could be her fortune. At the age of 20, she married and temporarily stopped working as a prostitute. However, the poverty she lived in with her husband and the death of her son at just 10 months due to malnutrition pushed her back into prostitution. Around the same time, her husband left her. In 1909, after saving enough money, Enriqueta attempted an upgrade, rented an apartment, and opened her first brothel. However, this was not a typical brothel. She kidnapped children aged 5 to 15 to prostitute them to some of the wealthiest and most depraved men in Barcelona. Her illicit activities were discovered by the police, and she was reported for exploiting child prostitution. Still, she never faced trial for this offense, thanks to her connections with high society figures. Instead, she expanded her even more dreadful business in a new location, the heart of the Rabel district, a poor and notorious area of the city. Her new operation still involved kidnapping children and forcing them into prostitution. However, this time, some of them were also selected and killed to extract their fat, blood, and hair, which she used to create elixirs and facial creams provided to a select group of prominent women from high society. She turned their bones into powder, eliminating the need to dispose of the bodies of her victims. Enriqueta offered ointments, salves, filters, and potions, especially to treat tuberculosis, which was greatly feared at that time, as well as other diseases that had no cure through conventional medicine. The wealthy paid substantial sums of money for these remedies and were well aware of their origins, but they considered these poor children as nothing more than trash. During those years, it seems that Enriqueta led a double life. During the day, dressed in rags, she roamed the city streets, particularly in the El Barrio Gótico and El Raval neighborhoods, luring children aged 3 to 8 with candies and toys. The children followed her trustingly, and their disappearances became increasingly frequent. At night, she transformed into an elegant lady who spent her evenings at the Teater del Isu and the new casino and Grand Hotel de la Rabasada. However, she didn't go there to gamble or engage in social life. She approached members of high society to offer the children she had lured and to sell her miraculous remedies. Many of the sexual encounters with the children apparently took place at the casino. Meanwhile, in Barcelona, news began to spread about a witch who kidnapped children from the streets and made them disappear. The children who went missing during those months numbered in the dozens, but it is believed to have been much higher since, in some cases, the disappearance of the children was not even reported, as they were often the children of prostitutes who did not want trouble with the law. Then, among others, on February 10, 1912, 5-year-old Teresita Guitar Congost disappeared. This time, however, the Spanish public, which had remained fairly silent about the disappearance of other children, was outraged, accusing the authorities of negligence. The little Teresita came from an upper-middle-class family, and her parents strongly voiced their concerns to newspapers and the police. A few days after the girl's disappearance, on February 17, a woman named Claudia Elias saw a girl peeking secretly from the window of a house across from her own at 29 Cali Ponient. Mrs. Elias thought it might be the missing girl and reported her suspicions to her husband, who informed the police about the strange woman living in that house with a child who had never been seen in the neighborhood before. Agent Ribbit and 2 policemen were sent for a search. When they entered the apartment, they found 2 girls in the house. When asked whose children they were, Enriqueta lied, claiming that one was her daughter Angelita, and the other, with a shaved head, was a child she had found abandoned on the street and taken in. However, when questioned by the agents, the shaved-headed child said that the woman had ordered her to say her name was Felicidad, but that her real name was Teresita, the missing girl. During the search inside the house, the agents found the room where Enriqueta killed her victims. Hidden within the walls and beneath the floor, they discovered pieces of cadavers preserved in jars for later use, along with bones, coagulated blood, fat, and whole body parts. Subsequent interrogations and searches revealed the entire truth. The 2 girls, in particular, told how, until a few days before, there had also been a boy, Pepito, who had been confined to what was later referred to as the Room of Horrors. There the girls said they had been forbidden to enter. However, they took advantage of the woman's absence and went to visit their companion in punishment. To their horror, they found nobody inside the room, but there was plenty of blood on the floor and a nauseating odor all around. The girls also recounted that when Enriqueta returned home and realized that the little ones had disobeyed her. She frightened them that evening by forcing them to eat a broth in which 2 small boiled feet floated. The agents immediately carried out the arrest, and Enriqueta was tried and sentenced to death. However, before the sentence could be carried out, she was found dead in her cell. Amelia Dyer, the nursemaid. In a context of extreme poverty and despair like that of the English slums in the late 19th century, death could take the forms of hunger, disease, and violence, but not only those. In those same neighborhoods of dilapidated houses and clothing reduced a little more than rags, a more sinister danger lurked, taking the shape of a woman named Amelia Dyer, responsible for an unconfirmed but estimated death toll of around 200 victims. And it is precisely the story of Amelia Dyer that we are going to tell, the murderer known as the nursemaid. Amelia Dyer was born in 1838 into an affluent family in Bristol. She was a child with early intelligence and vivacity, and a temperament well suited for learning. At the age of 24, she got married and devoted herself to nursing studies. For the first few years of the 1860s, her life seemed to proceed in the tranquility of family and work. Then, it is not precisely known when, it seems that Amelia met a certain Ellen Dane, a midwife, who suggested a simpler and more profitable way to make a living, caring for illegitimate children that mothers wanted to get rid of. In the Victorian era, the birth of illegitimate children was a real tragedy for mothers of every social class, and usually these babies were abandoned to die. In this desperate context, Amelia began to operate, offering young mothers an alternative to abandoning their infants. In essence, she offered to take in these illegitimate babies for a more or less modest fee. In some cases, it is confirmed that Dyer acted as an intermediary for a fee to facilitate the adoption of the babies by wealthy families. What needs to be clarified right away is that Amelia Dyer embarked on this career with the intention of pocketing the maintenance money without giving the infants any chance of survival. She adopted them and let them die. She did not consider them at all as children in need of care, but exclusively as a source of income. The money received for the maintenance of the newborns was meant to provide further profits and could not be wasted on feeding, clothing, or caring for the children. It's easy to understand how Amelia's house soon became a veritable house of horrors. The young residents often died of neglect, abandoned to their own devices. The crime was easy. All she had to do was nothing and wait for the children to die of hunger or neglect, to later pass those deaths off as crib deaths, eventually certified by doctors as natural deaths. In addition to this, the frequent use and abuse of opiate-based syrups were common to keep the children quiet, which could have lethal effects. However, Amelia initially proved to be too careless, and all these deaths in her home aroused suspicion from the doctor called to register the deaths. She was prosecuted and sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. After her release from prison, and despite being an alcoholic addicted to opium, she resumed her career as a nursemaid, continuing to eliminate babies and pocket their fees. The House of Horrors had, therefore, started claiming victims again, and it continued in this way until one mother, more suspicious than the others, realized that the child she was presented with was not her own. The accusation led Dyer to attempt suicide with laudanum, but she had taken it in small doses too often due to her addiction, and she survived. At this point, if the situation had already gone beyond any limits and Amelia's actions had been extreme from this moment on, the woman seemed to have no more inhibitions. Dyer began to directly kill the babies by her own hand and sign the death certificates herself before disposing of the bodies in the waters of the Thames. In January 1896, a young maid, Evelina Marmon, gave birth to an illegitimate girl, Doris, and entered into negotiations with Amelia, who, by now fearing discovery, had changed her name to Harding and started moving from city to city while continuing her nursemaid activities. However, to the young woman, Dyer's demands seemed strange. The nursemaid had asked her for a one-time payment for the care service instead of a monthly fee. The young maid agreed but soon stopped receiving any news. From what was later determined, the infant Doris Marmon had been strangled almost immediately by Dyer and her daughter. By moving from city to city and changing her name several times, Amelia finally began to call herself Mrs. Thomas. Under this name, she killed 13-month-old Harry Simmons and 1-year-old Helena Fry. Both were strangled with a ribbon, their bodies placed in sacks with bricks, and then thrown into the Thames. A few months later, the river returned the first small bodies. Around the neck of little Helena Fry, a ribbon was found with the inscription Mrs. Thomas. Investigations and surveillance were initiated to catch the murderous nursemaid. A young woman was even used as bait to ask Mrs. Thomas to care for a child, and Amelia fell into the trap. A search of Dyer's house found a white ribbon, similar to the one found on Helena Fry's body. In April, the Thames was dredged, and 6 more bodies were discovered, including those of Doris Marmon and Harry Simmons. Each child had been strangled with white ribbon, which was also found in her house. 11 days after leaving her daughter with Dyer, Evelina Marmon identified her daughter's remains. There was no escape left for the nursemaid. She was arrested and put on trial. The jury took 4 minutes to reach a guilty verdict for the woman. Amelia Dyer was sentenced to death by hanging. Her last words, just before the trapdoor beneath her opened, were, "I have nothing to say."